What's up, nerds? The United States is failing Ukraine, and we need to talk about this because while Russia is generating new forces and launching some of the largest attacks that they have in the entire war on Ukraine right now, the US is telling Ukraine to stop attacking Russian energy infrastructure. This while Congress still has yet to pass the Ukraine aid supplemental. We need to talk about this because it's just getting ludicrous at this point. First, let's talk about what Russia's been doing recently and how that kind of overshadows Ukraine at this moment, because there's a lot of information that we have not yet talked about on this channel that's very important in the context of what's going on. Now, first and foremost, Russia is announcing that it is forming new forces. Recently announced by Sergei Shoigu, Russia will be forming at least 2 new armies by the end of the year, which could include up to 40 new formations, and this could see up to 100,000 more troops be entered into uniform and brought to the front in Ukraine. This effort may be helped by a new round of mobilization, but it could also be helped by just additional volunteer efforts, including incentivizing people to join voluntarily through large paydays and other kinds of schemes that we've talked about before. And these forces could play a huge role in a new offensive for Russia, but if they are brought up later in the year and the offensive has already kicked off, then these forces could be used either to backfill those forces or to simply hold the line while those forces culminate. Now, the second important thing to note from Russia is a very important statement that comes from the Kremlin, because they have said that Russia is officially in a state of war. Now, this is the first time, at least, that I've seen that Russia has acknowledged that it is in a state of war. And of course, the Kremlin blames the West for their intervention in Ukraine as to why this has become a war. You might remember that before, using the word war when referring to what's going on in Ukraine and Russia would get you thrown in jail. However, of course, today, the Kremlin using that term, that this is a war, is of course very significant, not only politically, but also legally for Russia. They could use this as political justification for more drastic actions like another round of mobilization or even nationalization of certain industries for national security purposes. And nevertheless, this is all something that we need to be aware of because it will tell us potentially where Russia will be heading to in the next year or two. Now, the third thing to discuss is, of course, a massive Russian barrage by Russian bombers, cruise missiles, drones, pretty much everything that they've been stockpiling and that they could throw at the Ukrainians, targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure and other key targets. This is the largest series of strikes since the beginning of the war, at least that I could see, at least targeting energy infrastructure. And it included a barrage of over 150 missiles, leaving millions of Ukrainians without power. This included strikes on Ukraine's largest dam. However, this dam does not appear to be at risk of breaching. Now, all of these things overshadow an article that was just published by Financial Times that I think everybody that I've seen, at least that's been reading this, has been pulling their hair out to. Reportedly, the U.S. has been asking Ukraine to stop targeting Russian energy infrastructure. There's fear in the United States that the attacks on Russian energy infrastructure will drive up energy costs worldwide, and in the United States, that could lead to some problems with, prices at the pump and the election. In other words, the U.S. is asking Ukraine to stop doing what has been one of the most successful operations that it's been doing since the start of the war, because they're fearful that it's becoming more expensive for American taxpayers. Or really, the better term I should be using here is American voters. Despite sanctions on Russia, Russia has remained one of the world's largest energy exporters, though secondary sanctions appear to be cutting some amount of that export capacity, as well as the Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. However, since January of this year, energy costs have risen by over 15%. And with Ukraine capable of targeting the vast majority of Russian energy facilities in the west side of Russia, Ukraine could take out up to 60% of Russia's energy capacity. And we've seen Ukraine attempt to do so. They've targeted the vast majority of these facilities already with drone and missile strikes. Of course, there are concerns in the White House that rising gas prices here in the United States, rising costs at the pump, could cause election issues for President Biden in this coming election. Of course, Republican rhetoric on the other side could easily exploit this, talking about how Biden has been financing this conflict and really calling for this war to be cut off. Now, all of this with the Ukrainian aid supplemental still sitting in Congress, and with Congress entering into a 2-week recess if they do not pass it at the time of this recording on March 22nd, 2024. Now, these strikes by Ukraine have been incredibly impactful. They've not only damaged Russian facilities, but they've lowered the overall capacity of Russian infrastructure to produce refined oil and refined gas. At least if not permanently, then for a time, which is still important. But almost more importantly, it forces Russia to move air defense systems away from other areas to defend these sites that could potentially impact Russian air defense coverage in Ukraine. Not only all of this, but it's also a politically significant event because it shows that Russia is not impenetrable anymore, and it shows to Russians that they are not being protected by their government. Not only this, but there's the attack in Belgorod that has continued surprisingly up to this point, which that itself has forced Russian citizens to be evacuated from Belgorod and from certain parts of Belgorod and Kursk oblasts. These kinds of things are impacting the overall facade of security in Russia. At least this is what Ukraine is trying to do. Now, with this request to Ukraine to stop these attacks, I think it's overall just an asinine thing to request out of a country at war for its own national independence. Remember that Ukraine is fighting for survival, and it has been a very tough stretch for Ukraine in the past year. They've had multiple battlefield losses like Bakhmut and Avdiivka and the failed counteroffensive of last summer, and they're also dealing with wavering U.S. support, again with that aid supplemental stuck in Congress. And with this new report that the U.S. is asking them to stop doing what has been the most successful thing for them recently. And that the U.S. is asking them to stop these attacks because it's becoming more expensive for Americans. I mean, come on, man. It's totally deaf and lacking in perspective. And it feels like this is totally unserious to its core. It's based on political domestic concerns here in the U.S. and not on military objectives in Ukraine, which is a country at war here. Ask Irina Riva, who lost her son Vladislav in the fighting, whether she cares about gasoline prices at the pump in America. Check with Ina Yuzenko, who doesn't even know whether her brother is alive or dead after a Russian missile struck his apartment, whether she cares about what the American electorate thinks about gas prices. There are millions of Ukrainians who have already lost loved ones because of this war, and they're probably going to lose more loved ones because of this war because the U.S. is not being serious about this issue. And therefore, the U.S. is not just failing Ukraine, it's failing Ukrainians. And it's also failing Europe more broadly, because ultimately Europe is going to have to clean up this mess. Now, this sounds like something that shouldn't be America's problem, but it is, because we're also worried about Taiwan. There are Taiwanese people that are watching this whole situation wondering if they're going to lose loved ones because, again, we don't take any of this seriously. And of course, China is probably banking on the fact that we're not going to take it seriously because they are itching just to reunify with Taiwan. And yes, we've got issues here at home, and all of those issues will get much worse if we don't take security more seriously. And whatever side of the aisle you're on, left or right or center, I think we can all agree that we're not taking security seriously, and that is a problem. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on this because this was very frustrating, and especially, I read this first thing in the morning, which was not the best time to read something like that. And I think that this is lending credence to Russia's theory of victory, that the West will become tired, that the U.S. has a short attention span, and ultimately will become fatigued. And as long as Russia is willing to outlast the West, then they can do so. Well, we are proving their point right now through general incompetence and unseriousness. So I want to hear your thoughts on this because, boy, it's tough. And like this video if you enjoyed this analysis and you want to help support the channel. And subscribe if you haven't already. We talk about these kinds of issues on defense and international relations. So there's plenty more where this came from. With all that, I'll see you later. Bye.